everyone. My name is Elizabeth Manns, and I'd like to welcome you to the April 4th Coalition Show. This is the November 8th, 2021 edition of the show. It is week 375 and the 303rd show that we have done since the closing of the North Adams Regional Hospital. The April 4th Coalition mission statement is, we are for workers' rights and collective bargaining rights and are against tax breaks for the rich and corporations who ship our jobs overseas. We support all the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but as is our custom, we put the emphasis on Article 23 at the start of the show.
Okay.
You want to switch it up, or you want to first?
No, I'm ready. I'm just trying to look ahead, and you caught me. But Article 23, Section 1. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment. Number 2, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work.
Number 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration or compensation, ensuring for herself or himself and her or his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. Number 4, everyone has the right to form and join trade unions for the protection of his or her interests. We also always at this time do a shout out and thank you to both David Fabiano, who's directing the show these days with Paul's retirement, and also to Michael Putnam, who is the program director for the community radio on WMNBLP 107.1, who normally airs the audio portion of our show at 6 p.m. on Fridays. And Dick, you wanted to lead off again with the Native American video?
Yes, in the tradition of opening the meeting with some sort of tribute
recognition
to the people, the native peoples who inhabited this land first. I found a video on YouTube from the Smithsonian Channel. So it's about the Trail of Tears. So I thought that maybe, you know, we're in November, Thanksgiving's coming, but we should be reminded about the situation of the native people and
okay, and how it developed.
How their situation has unfolded thus far. So Dave, if you could show that, please.
For thousands of years, these mountains were home to the Cherokee, but they were just a small piece of their vast nation, which covered 40,000 square miles here in the Appalachian Mountains. In 1819, as more and more Americans started encroaching on Indian land, the U.S. government signed a treaty that guaranteed that Cherokee land would be off limits to white settlers forever. It clearly stated, all white people who have intruded or may hereafter intrude on the lands reserved for the Cherokees shall be removed by the United States. Confident that the U.S. government now recognized its sovereignty over its own lands, the Cherokee Nation proceeded to build itself a new capital in 1825, here in what's known as New Echota, Georgia. It had its own courthouse, council house, and post office, and even space for the first Indian language newspaper office in the nation. In 1829, Andrew Jackson was elected U.S. president. He believed that Native Americans were savages and had no rights to their land, and began proceedings to remove the Cherokee from the southern states to clear the way for white settlement. The next year, he signed the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which set in motion one of the most brutal actions ever taken by the U.S. government. Thousands of Native Americans were pulled from their homes in Georgia and other states across the South. Many were shackled in chains and forced to walk at gunpoint more than 1,000 miles west on a series of routes that all led to Oklahoma. Up to a third of the 15,000 Cherokee who were forced to make the journey died on the way, which is one reason that journey came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Their descendants are known today as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and live here on sovereign Indian land in Cherokee, North Carolina. Today, young Cherokee here at the local high school learn the language of their forebears. A vast stretch of their tribe's former land, right next to town, is now the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the nation.
Very beautiful land.
Yes, very
Reminds me a
beautiful
lot
land.
of here.
Quite a change to move to Oklahoma and be forced into it,
Yeah,
and all because of prejudice, a belief that their way of life wasn't as important as ours.
or they weren't human.
They weren't human,
Yeah.
which of course is wrong.
Right, which really
I always wondered when they moved back to North Carolina.
wasn't all of them. One-third died on the
One
trip.
third died
Yeah,
on that journey, which is just as bad as the forced marches in World War II. The Japanese had American soldiers going on to Bataan and a couple others along the way. Unfortunately, cruelty exists in all of us, and it manifests itself with that justification that
Yeah.
you're not human, you're the other.
right. And so when, people get upset and say, well, why are they changing the name of this baseball team? Or why are they changing the mascot of this team?
Right.
They should reflect on what happened in history and why those people might not want to be treated as a mascot for a money-making sports
Well,
industry.
Yes, they might not.
So I think I remember the words of Will Rogers. He talked about pioneers. And he talked about pioneers. He says, a lot of people say the pioneers lived off the land. And he said, no, they didn't. They lived off of future generations.
Yes, they did.
And that's where we're right now. In the world, there's a world conference taking
Yep,
place.
isn't it over now?
I'm not sure. I thought it was still going on. I think the
climate
big
one?
shots
big
are
shots.
still gone, but the people that are doing the heavy lifting, the work.
Oh, the workers are
think
still at the climate conference?
Yeah.
Because I know the political leaders were there last
Yeah,
week.
they make their quick statements and leave, but the people that hash out the agreements,
Right, the ones who have
I
to
think
make,
they're still
figure
there.
how to make
Maybe
it
I'm
work.
wrong, but
Who knows?
I
You wanted to tie that to the Native Americans, because if there is one select group of people, it's the Native Americans who actually did who kept the balance between their lives and the land. They kept the
Yes.
promise to the land and kept it pristine and pure, and lived their lives with the intention of being that way.
Right, and they were colonized. It was colonialism that drove them off the land. It was.
Yes.
And so we have a speech here by Greta Thunberg, and why don't we listen to it, and then maybe we can have some more comments about
Okay.
it.
It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. It should be obvious that we cannot solve a crisis with the same methods that got us into it in the first place. And more people are starting to realize this. Many are starting to ask themselves, what will it take for the people in power to wake up? But let's be clear, they are already awake. They know exactly what they are doing. This is no longer a climate conference. This is now a Global North Greenwash Festival. A 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah. The most affected people in the most affected areas still remain unheard. And the voices of future generations are drowning in their greenwash and empty words and promises. But the facts do not lie, and we know that our emperors are naked. to stay below the targets set in the Paris Agreement and thereby minimizing the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control, we need immediate, drastic, annual emission cuts unlike anything the world has ever seen. And as we don't have the technological solutions that alone will do anything even close to that, that means we will have to fundamentally change our society. And this is the uncomfortable result of our leaders' repeated failure to address this crisis. And the climate and ecological crisis, of course, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is directly tied to other crises and injustices that date back to colonialism and beyond. Crises based on the idea that some people are worth more than others and therefore have the right to steal others, to exploit others, and to steal their land and resources. And it is very naive of us to think that we could solve this crisis without addressing the root cause of it. And the question we must now ask ourselves is, what is it that we are fighting for? Are we fighting to save ourselves and the living planet? Or are we fighting to maintain business as usual? They cannot ignore our screams as we reclaim our power. We are tired of their blah, blah, blah. Our leaders are not leading. This is what leadership looks like.
Wow.
Wow. And I think it's important for the radio audience, at the very least, to know that that was a teenager or an adolescent,
Yeah.
because I don't really know her age. That was an adolescent giving that particular speech and condemning the status quo.
Right, and we have to listen, you know, we do
should
have to listen, and I think our leaders have to listen. You know, it is a problem, you know.
It's not going to go away. There, you can put up the strongest walls, but as history has shown, those walls are not going to hold up against the forces of nature when the
Right.
time comes.
The amount of money that has to be spent to deal with the refugee problem that's going to occur with climate change would probably
Be 10
would
times to
dwarf
our
what we really have to spend to make things right. But we
Right.
do have to change. There's people with investments in fossil fuels, and they don't want to give that up, even though they know that it is the problem.
And it seems short-sighted to me because they could have been making, alongside with their current investment in fossil fuel, they could have been investing in the technologies they could have been doing the research decades ago and then be ready to invest in this new technology and this new method of bringing down emissions or whatever else needs to be done in the environment. You could have been ahead of the curve instead of maintaining the status quo. And now everybody, because of the short-sightedness of various industries, are behind the curve. And sooner or later, the bill is going to come due.
Well, there's very powerful interests that are involved in this, and I think a lot of the reasons why our problems aren't addressed is because of the wealth inequality in this, in the people with the wealth use it to make sure that their power
Stays
is
in place.
maintained. So we have another video with Robert Reich, and he explains a little bit about wealth inequality. And I think, I'd like to show that. I
Okay.
think we have enough time for that. And
Elon Musk's wealth has surpassed $200 billion. It would take the median U.S. worker over 4 million years to make that much. Wealth inequality is eating this country alive. We're now in America's second Gilded Age, just like the late 19th century, when a handful of robber barons monopolized the economy, kept wages down, and bribed lawmakers. While today's robber barons take joyrides into space, the distance between their gargantuan wealth and the financial struggles of working Americans has never been clearer. During the first 19 months of the pandemic, U.S. billionaires added $2.1 trillion to their collective wealth, and the rich have enough political power to cut their taxes to almost nothing, sometimes literally nothing. In fact, Jeff Bezos paid no federal income taxes in 2007 or in 2011. By 2018, the 400 richest Americans paid a lower overall tax rate than almost anyone else. But we can't solve this problem unless we know how it was created in the first place. Let's start with the basics. Wealth inequality in America is far larger than income inequality. Income is what you earn each week or month or year. Wealth refers to the sum total of your assets. Your car, your home, art, anything else you own that's valuable. Valuable not only because there's a market for it, a price other people are willing to pay to buy it, but because wealth itself grows. As the population expands and the nation becomes more productive, the overall economy continues to expand. This expansion pushes up the values of stocks, bonds, rental property, homes, and most other assets. Of course, recessions and occasional depressions can reduce the value of such assets, but over the long haul, the value of almost all wealth increases. Next, personal wealth comes from two sources. The first source is the income you earn but don't spend. That's your savings. When you invest those savings in stocks, bonds, or real property or other assets, you create your personal wealth, which, as we've seen, grows over time. The second source of personal wealth is whatever is handed down to you from your parents, grandparents, and maybe even generations before them. In other words, what you inherit. The wealth gap between the richest Americans and everyone else is staggering. In the 1970s, the wealthiest 1% owned about 20% of the nation's total household wealth. Now, they own over 35%. Much of their gains over the last 40 years have come from a dramatic increase in the value of shares of stock. For example, if someone invested $1,000 in 1978 in a broad index of stocks, say the S&P 500, they would have $31,823 today, adjusted for inflation. Who's benefited from this surge? The richest 1%, who now own half the entire stock market. But the typical worker's wages have barely grown. Most Americans haven't earned nearly enough to save anything. Before the pandemic, when the economy appeared to be doing well, almost 80% were living paycheck to paycheck. So as income inequality has widened, the amount that the few high-earning households save, their wealth, has continued to grow. Their growing wealth has allowed them to pass on more and more wealth to their heirs. Take, for example, the Waltons, the family behind the Walmart empire, which has 7 heirs on the Forbes billionaires list. Their children and other rich millennials will soon consolidate even more of the nation's wealth. America is now on the cusp of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. As wealthy boomers pass on, somewhere between $30 to $70 trillion will go to their children over the next 3 decades. These children will be able to live off this wealth and then leave the bulk of it, which will continue growing, to their own children, tax-free. After a few generations of this, almost all of America's wealth could be in the hands of a few thousand families. Concentrated wealth is already endangering our democracy. Wealth doesn't just beget more wealth, it begets more power. Dynastic wealth concentrates power in the hands of fewer and fewer people who can choose what nonprofits and charities to support and which politicians to bankroll. This gives an unelected elite enormous sway over both our economy and our democracy. We might come to resemble the kind of dynasties common to European aristocracies in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Dynastic wealth makes a mockery of the idea that America is a meritocracy where anyone can make it on the basis of their own efforts. It also runs counter to the basic economic ideas that people earn what they're worth in the market, and that economic gains should go to those who deserve them. Finally, wealth concentration magnifies gender and race disparities because women and people of color tend to make less, save less, and inherit less. The typical single woman owns only 32 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth owned by a man. The pandemic likely increased this gap. The racial wealth gap is even starker. The typical black household owns just 13 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth owned by the typical white household. The pandemic likely increased this gap too. In all these ways, dynastic wealth creates a self-perpetuating aristocracy that runs counter to the ideals we claim to live by. The last time America faced anything comparable to the concentration of wealth we face today was at the turn of the 20th century. That was when President Teddy Roosevelt warned that, quote, a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their power, unquote, could destroy American democracy. Roosevelt's answer then was to tax wealth. Congress enacted two kinds of wealth taxes. The first, in 1916, was the estate tax, a tax on the wealth someone has accumulated during their lifetime, paid by the heirs who inherit that wealth. The second tax on wealth, enacted in 1922, was a capital gains tax, a tax on the increased value of those assets paid when those assets are sold. But both of these wealth taxes have shrunk since then, or become so riddled with loopholes that they haven't been able to prevent a new American aristocracy from emerging. The Trump Republican tax cut enabled individuals to exclude $11.18 million from their estate taxes. That means one couple can pass on more than $22 million to their kids tax-free. Not to mention the very rich often find ways around this tax entirely. As Trump's former White House National Economic Council Director Gary Cohn put it, only morons pay the estate tax. What about capital gains on the soaring values of wealthy people's stocks, bonds, mansions, and works of art? Here, the biggest loophole is something called the stepped-up basis. If the wealthy hold on to their assets until they die, their heirs inherit them without paying any capital gains taxes whatsoever. All the increased value of those assets is simply erased for tax purposes. This loophole saves heirs an estimated $40 billion a year. This means that huge accumulations of wealth in the hands of a relatively few households can be passed from generation to generation untaxed, growing along the way, generating comfortable incomes for rich descendants who will never have to work a day of their lives. That's the dynastic class we're creating right now. Why have these two wealth taxes eroded? Because as America's wealth has concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, the wealthy have more capacity to donate to political campaigns and public relations. And they've used that political power to reduce their taxes. It's exactly what Teddy Roosevelt feared so many years ago. So what do we do? Follow the wisdom of Teddy Roosevelt and tax great accumulations of wealth. The ultra-rich have benefited from the American system, from laws that protect their wealth, and our economy that enabled them to build their fortunes in the first place. They should pay their fair share. The majority of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, believe the ultra-rich should pay higher taxes. There are many ways to make them do so: closing the stepped-up basis loophole, raising the capital gains tax, and fully funding the Internal Revenue Service so it can properly audit the wealthiest taxpayers. For starters, beyond those fixes, we need a new wealth tax, a tax of just 2% a year on wealth in excess of $1 million. It's hardly a drop in the bucket for centibillionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but it would generate plenty of revenue to invest in healthcare and education so that millions of Americans have a fair shot at making it. One of the most important things you as an individual can do is take the time to understand the realities of wealth inequality in America and how the system has become rigged in favor of those at the top, and demand your political representatives take action to unrig it. Wealth inequality is worse than it has been in a century. We have to stop this vicious cycle and demand an economy that works for the many, not one that concentrates more and more wealth in the hands of a privileged few.
Wow.
Oh, that's Robert. He gets the history right every time, and it's going to take people power to make the change, because the only thing politicians have a relative concern about is if they can't get reelected. And that's only if people wake up and see that the politician isn't, are they working for you or are they not? And I think you'll find the majority are not.
Yeah. I highly recommend that people listen to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. He started a group. He has these virtual meetings through the radio hour. But what they do is they set up, they say locally what we should be doing is sending out more or less, not requests, but demands that our elected officials meet us and discuss these issues.
Right.
Pick a time and a place, we'll do it virtually or whatever.
Whatever.
You know, and let's talk about wealth inequality and what are you going to do about it? So the people in North Adams or the people in this district, this congressman's district, we want to talk about this.
So
And
we want to have a
send them
town hall with
saying,
Richie Neal
and
and
we want
Elizabeth
you to
Warren.
talk about this issue. And we want to learn about it from you, and we want you to know that we're interested in this issue.
Right.
And that's the only way we can get the power to go to the people.
Absolutely. I do want to say, because only 25 seconds, remember to thank a veteran come November 11th, which is this week, because that's Veterans Day. They've all the living have sacrificed a lot, just as much as the dead, if not more, because they're still paying the price for their service. So we'll hopefully see you next week as we wind on down. Power to the people.
There's power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in our union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. The strikes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches full of mud, war's always been the bosses.